Okay, well, hello everybody. Welcome to this Tavola Aperta. Our guest today is Anri Sala. We were supposed to have this open table also with Eddie Rama, which is your longtime friend, but who could not be here with us today because of the elections tomorrow in Albania. So we will be having this dialogue with you today. Anri Sala is exhibiting this year in the Corderia here. I think most of you saw his work in the Pavilion of Traditions. And I wanted to start the first question with asking you what was the starting point of the piece, which is called All of a Tremble, Encounter 1. What was the starting point of this piece, and why did you decide to bring this piece to this year's Biennale?
Well, thank you everybody for being here, and thank you for organizing this. Very generous, and it's a great format. First, I think the piece itself is a lot about the idea of encounter. Encounter meaning at the same time that there is a chance in it. There is something which is not planned. And my encounter was first with these objects, which were a little bit... the very first time I saw these rollers, it was in a vintage shop in Berlin, somewhere in a corner, like a bit out of place. Because it was not a necessarily specialized vintage shop, it was just a place where you buy nice second-hand furniture, and this, which is usually always ideas which are applied, and they make a sense for being there, or decorative things, but which are also applied. And this one had this sort of, it was a little bit autistic in relation to the place, and this is what attracted me, that it was there without being there, without knowing what was there to serve as a purpose. And it was a group of rollers, none of them from the ones here, and this is my very first encounter with it. And then before that I did develop for a very site-specific project in Japan, in a house, in a traditional house in an island. As part of my project in this house was a piece which contained a roller of a completely different pattern, which is applied on Japanese mortar, the way how they built their houses there. So it's quite different from this because it does have an encounter with the place, and also another, I mean, this work has two pairs of encounters which are important. It's the encounter of the two patterns, but also the encounter of the roller with the comb, with the musical comb that plays it. And within this musical comb, there is another encounter, which is the musical scales. And for this one specifically, it's a mix between Western scales, quarter tone scales, and Indonesian scales, called pelog scales. There are 3 of them. And there is, the intervals are completely different. The mathematics of it are very different. The imagination that they do engender is very different. Like the quarter tone is more like it's a semitonal approach, while the pelog scales are it's a microtonal approach with very precise shifts around the tones. So it becomes a bit like a crossing of different encounters. So to go back to the one in Japan, it was more simply, it was more an encounter of the roller and its own motif with the mortar and that place by the sea. One thing which was very different is that the very first one which I did, which was in Japan, is that the process of doing it, it was on a mortar wall, so it was very specific. You needed a Japanese master to do it, but the thing was done in 30 minutes. Like, you do it while it's wet before it dries. So this one here, which is more independent because it carries, regardless of the place, it carries within itself the conflict of the encounter, of the two partners, etc. In this one here, the making of the drawing was very long. It took like around 6 weeks to do the drawing of the wallpaper in my studio by an assistant of mine. The process somehow contradicts the very nature of the roller, because the roller corresponded in a given moment in in the technological progress with trying to do with less manual labor. And so this one does reverse that process, because this one, for the wall for the drawing to become, it really takes a longer time and a hell of a lot of manual labor. So I was interested in contradicting the nature of the objet trouvé, of what it and why it was meant for.
Yeah. Also, where does this idea of using the music box come from? I mean, I suppose in your work, especially in the last 10 years, music plays a very important role. It's nearly central. It's used as an expression instead of words, for example. In this work, you don't use a video, and so you don't have you use a different kind of music by using this music box. But where did that come from?
Well, I previously worked with the notion of the music box for another film, but the moment that I saw this roller and it spotted, immediately I thought of sound. And although obviously it's a large drawing, at the same time it's almost like the piece is like both a drawing and a musical instrument. On the other side, it does share something, has something in common with my work, which is, even in my film work, I'm always interested in the moment and the place where the sound becomes. So where action turns into sound. Yeah. So if in the films very often is human action, sometimes it's also can be a music box or a bar and organ. Here it's the same thing. It's the work interests itself from this very place where sound becomes and where a pattern is transformed into sound. Which brings me back to your previous question, which I realized I didn't fully answer, is that I was very interested also upon speaking with Christine, I was very interested in this idea of giving a voice to a background. Yeah. Usually there is, one is always interested in the foreground. Yeah. Is always interested in what happens in the center of the room. And also in the context of the Biennale, I thought it was interesting to take a step back, or for the image to take a step back and the sounds to take a step forward and reverse this relation of power, may I say, between the image and the sound, because when one passes by, it's like a passing by piece in a way. It does not want to be the center of something, and when one passes by, the image is the background, and the main actor or the main actress is the roller that produces the sound. So it's reversing this thing and giving a voice to the background that I was interested in.
Yeah, and also there is this sensation that the music is printing the wall in a certain sense. But another thing I noticed, sometimes when the corridors are crowded, you don't hear actually too much, and you don't understand the music that's played because of all the noise around. So you have to go closer, and that's when you see all the people looking how it really works. So it is a sort of background, but the roller takes you, attracts you to go and see what is happening, and in a certain sense try and understand better not only how it works, but also why is it there. Another thing, Adirama is not here today, but I noticed, I don't know how much it's a coincidence or not, that also his work is a wallpaper in a certain sense.
I think it's like we should just see in the background, it's another artist from Kosovo, Albania.
Because maybe we have done a lot of Tavola Aperta without mentioning this wallpaper.
Of Petrit, yeah.
It's a wallpaper. Just once, so let's do it twice. It's Petrit Alilaj, who is an artist you know quite well. He's originally from Kosovo, not far from Albania. And he did this work before the Biennale, but I thought it was meaningful here because it's a printing of the book in which he learned to read, which for him was an important opening to the world, and it's called Abetare, the alphabet, and for him it was very special because there was his name mentioned in this book. There is the Petrit page, And so it's a very autobiographical story about how you begin to learn things, and you open your mind to books, which is an important issue here. And talking about infancy, I wanted to also talk more, I would say, on a human level about Anri, about the fact that he learned music before going into visual arts. And now he has this kind of obsession in transforming the visual into music, which would be a sort of retro movement to his own initiation to the world of sound. You played the violin as a kid, and then growing up in Tirana, and then you went to the fine art school where you learned to paint first, and then you discovered video thanks to Eddie Ila, who is a great painter, actually visible at Documenta in Kassel, among others. And then you moved to Paris with Eddie Ila, who is now the Prime Minister.
Eddie Rama.
Eddie Rama. They all call Eddie Eddie Rama, Eddie Ila. There is another
Eddie
one.
Muka.
Eddie Muka, who is a curator. So you moved to Paris with Eddie Rama, and at the time he was an artist, an artist before being a political man. So that was quite special. You went there, and you went to the School of the Art Décoratif in Paris, and that's where you met someone who introduced you to video, and then gradually your work about using video was interested in sound. I remember this piece with the tomahawk, the story. So maybe let's go back to this, your more personal story about how music and sound appeared in your life and was intertwined with the visual.
I think you described the beginning and said that, yes, I did study violin for 7 years before when I was a kid, and actually my interest in image was a reaction to being a bit fed up with my violin studies. And then I went through studying painting, composition in image, and as well as fresco, and then it's upon arriving in Paris that I got interested in video and film in a very much more continuous way. But I think somehow before I went, my interest for the sound and the music grew. It was more like a reaction than an affirmative action. It was a reaction to my sudden distrust in language. Like one of my earlier works that I did when I arrived in Paris at the Art Deco was a film which features my mother. Called Intervista, and it's a film which I did. What triggered the film is that I found this as my parents moved. I had already moved to Paris, and as they moved, because me and my sister had both left, and they moved to a smaller apartment. When I returned for summer holidays, they asked me to sort of choose what I wanted to keep and throw away because there's too many things to carry in a smaller place. And they had put somewhere in a corner everything they thought it was from their son, the artist, like everything related to image. And so I found this tin, tin box with a reel of film, which wasn't mine, but I just took it with me to Paris. And since I was studying in the Art Deco, and there you had the means to see Super 8, 60 millimeter film, I took it with me. And this is where I discovered this reel of a film where you see my mother, and she's young, and it corresponds to a period when she was a secretary of the communist youth during the communist regime in Albania. But the sound is lost. So the only way for me to find the sound was to go back to Tirana and seek for the help of students from a school with a listening impaired. So it was about translating the movement of the lips into language, into subtitles. So, and this moment of translation, where finally I'm able to give not a voice, but to give the words on the moving lips, this is the moment which, of course, I expected to be quite a very squared political speech, but there was something quite surprising and shocking in the lack of articulation for somebody who is very articulated as a person, who was very articulate, somebody who was used to speaking in public, etc. So, and she was my mother was very surprised when I showed her the film with the subtitles on. She could not believe that she spoke like that. She did not question the political content, because back then, if you spoke in a public or in a state, I mean, you really needed to trust people very much to be able to say anything which would deviate or drift outside the political message of the regime. But she was shocked to how unarticulated her Albanian was. And I think in part, or mainly, this was because of language. It was so much like what you call in French, langue de bois. It was so controlled that after that, when the regime and the logics and the language and the whole formation, the whole structure of the regime broke down, the language was too much a langue de bois to be able to, in a flawless way, continue with the transition of the society. So if you would read this speech 20 years later, it's shocking how unarticulated it comes across. So all this very long thing to say that my very first work, I realized it triggered me a distrust for language and a distrust for linguistic syntax and the opacity of the language. And this is what did orientate my interest into sound, and after that, immediately after that, music, as a way to which also deal with their own syntax, but which are more transparent, less opaque. And then, little by little, I realized that there are other things that did interest me in sound and music, and this is something we have spoken with Christine in the different exhibition or project we've done together. It's that how the music and sound has a quality, a capacity to convey things instead of telling them. So there is a difference between storytelling and narrative. And so if we go back to the piece which is here, it does have its own narratives. It's the narratives of taste and a narrative of encounter between anonymous people who had chosen those patterns as their backgrounds. A narrative of differences. But on the other side, it conveys it. There is nothing to prove about it. It's not the message has not been framed, and so there is an implicitness in it which does allow me to develop my way of work in a way that language doesn't, for the reasons that I said before, for reasons related to its but that mainly all gather under the auspices of being very explicit. And just to be clear, I'm speaking of language the way how it's used in everyday life, but also in politics. Of course, there is a whole capacity of language through poetry to be implicit and to convey things without naming them. But still, largely speaking, this is what did allure me towards sound and music. This moment of breaking with language.
Is there anybody who wants to ask something, or I'll go on? Hello. When you start doing a piece, does the music come first, or how does it work? How is the creative process? Even though I imagine it's very different from one work to another, maybe because they are different, but...
Most of the time, what I can say that most of the time when I start working on a piece, it's not the image that comes first. Then it can be music, but not music as a melody, but music as a way to structure time and space, and music as an interval. For example, many of the works that I've done with music in a more... where music really replaces the script, so to say, there is there is an importance of the interval in it. And interval means architecture. For example, a work that which is the pavilion, the French pavilion 4 years ago that Christine curated. This is a work about its music, it's Ravel, it's a left-hand concerto, and there's many things that come with it, both historically and politically. But at the end, the very soul of the piece is about the interval, and it's about the architecture of this relation between the two executions of the same concerto. So first the ideas come either as a sense of space or sound and music, but not image. So very often after, for me, because music, the making of the music, the playing of the music, it triggers its own image, because it triggers an action, and the action is, one can represent that action, and it triggers a choreography. It triggers labor as well. So the moment that music is there and it triggers that image, for me after, what is very important is how to imagine it in image, and how to work with image in a way that it does not overwhelm the sound, that does not replace it, that we don't go back to this very obvious and omnipresent hierarchical relation where image comes first and sound comes after. And for example, once I remember working on the exhibition at the Pompidou, we used this to play back the exhibition, which was a bit complex in terms of audio and video. We used this. Exactly. We use this playback system, where the sound triggers the whole program, because the time code is with the sound. Usually the time code is with the image, and time code is power. It's like who controls what. And I was very interested. I chose that system because this is what allowed for that exhibition to take that shape. But then it was very interesting to discover that back then, because things have evolved, that the only playback program that could play that idea, that group of works together, was a program where the time code was with the sound, where the sound had the control of how and where the things were happening, and when it needed to trigger the image with itself or not.
Yeah, you just mentioned power, and I have some questions about that, but one simple question I have is about collecting sounds. Do you collect sounds? Do you go around with a digital recorder? And
no, I don't collect sounds. I have a friend with whom I've been collaborating since 18 years now, who is the sound designer with whom I work. And so we often travel together, whether to mix an exhibition or for a shooting, etc. And he does collect sound. Basically, when we finish working, Olivier Guanard, he finished working, and then you just see him somewhere, whether it's in Japan or somewhere else, like with his recorder and enriching, like expanding the sound library, from which I take things after, of course, when they're needed. But no, I don't do that. And somehow, when we speak of image, there was a period when I would go around with a photo camera, for example, and take an image which I was not looking for. But even this has been quite reduced, in the sense that, so I never did it with sound, I did it with image, this idea of looking around and something attracts you, and it's not you calling for it. But with time, this also changed. Like, I do not go around. I mean, yes, we all have iPhones, and sometimes if I need to take a picture, I do, but I don't go anymore around with something that eventually would interest me, and I want to have it in stone.
So what do you do every day? You go to the studio with your team?
But it depends. It depends on the everyday. Yes, it depends if I'm traveling, if I'm installing something, if I'm in Berlin. So it's a big difference between being in the everyday in Berlin, where my studio is and where I live, and the everyday wherever I'm working in a given. And then it depends if I'm completely working on one project. For example, when I'm shooting a film, or when I'm mixing or editing the sound or editing the film, then I'm almost 99% of it, I'm completely within it. And this is what I do for a few weeks. But then there are other moments when you work on different exhibitions and you deal with things, and so it can be very different.
No, but I've seen you, like, for example, in the studio, you make models of shows, you make drawings, you have a team around you.
I do, yeah.
You have also your solitary practice. Sometimes you do small experiments. I remember the work with the hands that you were trying to do at home, you know? So
I think, I mean, this is always the difficult thing of how to manage this between the solitary practice and moments when you're with yourself, but also moments that you you need to do work with the other people. I think my more solitary moments are when I'm traveling, when I'm not in the studio. The studio is more of a place of action.
So traveling at the moment where you finally can concentrate on your...
Absolutely, yeah. Or even better, even in terms of reading, or yes. I mean, I do also read at home, but because everything becomes more. The relation with myself gets enhanced in the moments when I travel, and so everything that one does as a solitary action has its own moment, has its day in these moments.
Do you guys
be shy?
Not judgmental. If you have any questions that you want to ask?
I had a question on your piece. Sorry.
Yeah. Can you take a micro? I don't know if there's one down there. Okay. And then...
Yeah. Hello. Yeah. Hi. With the patterns of the wallpaper, what influenced you to do those specific patterns, and why is repetition involved with those?
Yeah, thank you. What interests me with these two patterns is both that their difference, how both they project two completely different backgrounds, that you can imagine people of different tastes and beliefs and ways of being living with these backgrounds. But also because they enable something that is extremely practical but very important, is that both rowers that then I sliced and joined together, they are exactly of the same diameter. In the sense that I could have chosen two other patterns as much as I liked them. One can't make them play together because the moment that the rowers would have a different diameter, they couldn't make a joint rower together. So they are together by choice and necessity at the same time, which I like in the sense that they are together. I'm interested in this idea of control and let go, and actually this is something which is important in this piece, but also in my other works, because I do, in order to construct something, in order to enable and empower something that otherwise you forget about it, you need to control a lot the conditions around it. Otherwise, things which are already important, they always carry the day. So if you want to produce, to bring attention and produce reality in things that otherwise don't seem to have this intention given as a priori, you really need to enable them, you really need to produce a very clear condition around them. So this is anticipating, or this is composing, etc. But on the other side, I'm also very interested by the notion of letting go. So in this piece, both notions come together because I choose the notes together with a musician, Robert Schneider. We choose the scales, like I said before, this encounter between a European scale and the Indonesian scale. But when they are going to play, it's completely decided by the rower itself. Because it's like a found object. So it's both yet an encounter between, to some extent, controlling which are the tones, but completely not being able to control when they are going to be triggered and activated by the comb itself. So this is an aspect that it's not so obvious, but that's an aspect that's very important to me. This how to combine control with let go, and how to anticipate the letting go, and then you bring it back into the controllable part. And this is, for example, the roller. I mean, it's always the same, but the way how it repeats, because it goes to your question about the repetition, it repeats, but the speed of repetition is never the same. So it takes around, if I remember well, around 18 minutes before a full loop is done. So, of course, it's not like the notes change or the rhythmical pattern can change, because the rhythmical pattern is strongly associated with a image pattern. But still, the fact is that by slowing down a lot, you create new relations. And for example, just to give one simple example of this is like what I, in my studio, used to call one the grandma pattern and the other one the Mondrian pattern, just because of the, just a way of, a nickname, a way of saying, oh, which one, this and that. So you should say so the geometrical pattern, it has these long lines, and these long lines, the moment they are supposed to play the comb at the same time. So this musically it produces what is called a cluster, which also relates a lot to music of the beginning of the last century, like clusters, serialism, etc. But so the moment that I play it relatively at a good pace, it sounds like a cluster. But the moment that I play it very slowly, it becomes like a chromatic scale, because the teeth won't play at the same time. So it goes like pa, 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 exactly, like an arpeggio. So it's suddenly the same element meeting the same tones can produce two sounds, which are, one could sound from the 19th century and the other one sounds from the 20th century. So these are the details which are very important to me, both in terms of anticipating the potential of the object and of the piece, but also anticipating how the composition. And also make a difference, like when I was speaking with the musician, it's about, we would make a simulation, because you can't leave all this to see what will happen in the last moment when the comb is ready. So somehow we simulated the sounds before the comb was produced, so that we could decide which should be the tones, the values of this. And we would hear the clusters, and we would hear also the cluster as an arpeggio, if it was not activated precisely at the same moment.
Yeah, you.
My question was very much related to this one. Between the grandma pattern and the Mondrian pattern, did you associate Western to one or an Indonesian to the other, since it's quite a synesthetic experience, or was it just the idea of confronting two different visual and sound pattern? And in this case, which one came first? This is the contrasting visual pattern that induced you to choose two different scales, or the way around?
I think what induced me to have two different scales, and again, one of the scales, the Pelog one, is made of three, because there are three different Pelog scales. So altogether you have 4 scales within it. But it's not that there is one for one pattern and one for the other, because if you see them, there is a lot of overlapping, especially because the grandma pattern, you can see it's rhythmically in different places, but it covers very well the whole length of the comb. While the Mondrian one, there are moments of like blank, and there are moments of the motif. So yes, the moments when it goes blank or motif, it takes away precisely certain scales, but not necessarily it takes away completely the Western and it only carries the other one, because like I said, there is overlapping between the... so it's impossible that you could associate one scale to one and then it would not be heard at all in the other one, because the grandma covers the full comb. But the fact that it switches on and off when the Mondrian plays, the fact that it switches on and off certain parts, just because there are parts where there is no at all any present of the reeds of the motif, and there are parts where they are, this is what produces the difference. And this where, like, we would listen a lot, like in this simulation we did, of the different relations, like, okay, do we switch off the Célicyr Pelog, or do we switch off the quarter tone up, or do we switch on the quarter tone down, and what sort of relations it will produce in terms of music and cohabitation between the sounds. So it's not black and white. There is a lot of overlapping. But these are, in fact, things which took a lot of consideration and a lot of time to decide and then produce accordingly.
Is that working?
Yeah.
Just in relation to the music, there are many scales in the world, blues scale and gypsy scales, and Why did you choose the Indonesian scale? Is there a history to that?
No, I mean, like you said, there are many different scales. Like in the previous work, I had worked between a chromatic scale and a kumoi scale, which is a Japanese scale. And then you have the scales in the Arabic culture. So, of course, and it's all about how you imagine the world. It's all these mathematical relations. But there, it's also, we discussed, and when we saw, it leads to the question before, and what I was saying is that when you see how the two patterns follow each other, overlap, or do not, depending on the places, you had to find scales that could speak that difference in the most articulated way possible. And so this is how we came to it. So it's not extremely theoretical. The only thing which was theoretical or conceptual was that I did want to have an encounter between two geographies in the comp. But then the fact that there were so many, that the grandmother pattern is everywhere, and then the Mondrian has these sections of on and off, etc., but it's not so black and white, it's not binary at all in that sense, then I think this is what intuitively led us to and also to the musician to propose me the Peleg scales, because there are 3 of them. So, but I guess if you would have only Western scales, the whole thing would sound too much within one logic, and might also sound a little bit too much like a Christmassy scene. And it was very important to break this. That's why the Peleg, being microtonal, it turns it off. It drifts it away from its own logic. So it's no longer like a closed system, but it's a system that drifts in and out of itself.
Come on, guys. Anybody else? Questions?
Could you tell us a little bit, since you have been working with Eddie Rama, about power and art? I mean, power has always sought art as a means to validate itself. Money, religion, going to art and asking for validation. But now there's a very special situation where power and art are together, or the artist is in power and you have been exposed to that. And any thoughts about all that entire experience, the artist being in power, and how the artist can be subversive, because an artist sometimes subverts the power that pays for, but in this case, the artist is in power too. Any thoughts about that?
Well, I think it's all of the above together. It's not one answer that applies to all. It's always easier if one takes it by example when one thinks or tries to find an answer about it. For example, what seems one of the most obvious moments of encounter between the artist and the politician is his project with the colors in Tirana, where he was mayor, which was a very successful project. I think it's very clear, and he has also said it himself, that it was not an artist project, it was a political project. Color was used like a agency for political change. It was then, of course, one can break it down and say, do I like these forms, the triangles, how? And I do find a quality, and I can talk about why I found them in their physical manifestation in the city, why I liked a lot how did he break the surfaces in the different colors. But that would be more like an aesthetical thing. But it was purely a political action by using color. So there, it's not, one could say, definitely, maybe one needs to be an artist, or one needs to be of another kind of a politician, with a different kind of imagination, to be able to see such a potential into color, which also from the very practical point of view was, like he says, was a 0 nothing to the budget of the city compared to other transformations that needed completely other sorts of budget. So this is one thing. I think the fact that we do come from a history of a country which was under dictatorship, where politics controlled everything and controlled. I mean, I do remember when I was becoming an artist and when I was studying in the school, the regime changed when I was almost finishing my high school studies. So I was already in an art school, and I completely remember this moment and how things developed, like how controlled the expression was, like what was possible to do and what was clearly impossible to do, what was forbidden, etc. So we are not naive about, when you come from that historical background, you are not naive about the relation between politics and art. But I think, and I think this is what what's his belief as well, that there is a possible encounter between there are possible bridges between politics and art, which could be for the benefit of the society, not for the benefit of the politicians.
I remember one point about Eddie, because we talked with him several times in lectures and so on, and he answered precisely what you said, that it was not an artistic act. And he said that he used colors as an aesthetical mean. He was asking the people and making some projects with artists to cover the buildings of Tirana with colors and patterns, because it was a way to provoke the population of Tirana, because they were not aware of what is a public space because of the dictatorship. So just like having this discussion about the facades of the streets and what should be their city was his aim, actually, you know, because his aim was to open something that was not known at the time in Tirana, was a democratic way of talking about the public space. And this is the most, I think, significant act of this project, which is not so much artistic, but really political in the higher sense of the word, like trying to show what democracy is to people who didn't have this practice of.
And actually, and then you can, if you see that we are too much answering in one place, then we can open it again. But just to finish this argument,
let's critique a bit. We are
yeah.
too positive.
Yeah, but just to finish this thing about democracy, and what is very interesting that the project of the colors was para-democratic. It was not democratic in the sense that people were not asked to choose the colors of their, just to be like
it was very
crystal clear about it. It was something that it was a bit in avant-garde of what, yes. Yeah. So it's the step before. It does, whenever in the beginning when I was showing the film Dami Colori and we were talking about it, everybody took it for granted that actually everybody was choosing the colors, this sort of happy together. But that was, and this leads back to what Christine was saying, that in Albania, because we went through the communist regime, which everything was supposed to be about what's public, what's shared, what's common, and people were stolen from their own individuality, from their own being. Suddenly, after the 90s, they hated public space. Everything which associated to public space, it was the space of the other or the space of nobody. So this was what was, color was one of these things that in a very unexpected and quite direct way dealt with this and brought the discussion of a public space back into the public realm, because nobody cared about it anymore.
It's very interesting to see how Tirana has changed this year. When I came back, I've seen it, what he has done in 10 years. How is, because the link between power and art has continued to develop. For example, he has transformed the building, which is the house of the Prime Minister and the government, into a kind of public space for the people in Tirana, and as well in an art center, which is also very much criticized. Let's not say that everything is perfect in this project. Like it was like for the coloring the walls in Tirana, there is a lot of debate, and especially in Tirana, people are very intense. So because of course he chose with a committee of people what artists should do the works, like Carsten Henner, Philippe Parello, and so on. Thomas Demand was opening the space with a small exhibition. But it's really special when you go there. Of course, you can still criticize that there is an authoritarian decision. But, you know, that's something I've never seen anywhere else in the world. That's a space where people can go, see an exhibition, meet, do whatever meeting they want, actually. It's a sort of forum. And it's the first room you find in this government building. So without being naive or too positive, I would say that that's a very challenging encounter between politics and art.
Yeah, I have read about this center, the Center for Openness and Dialogues, right? And I wish I had seen it personally. But my concern is, I was thinking last night, because you're an artist. As an artist, I can see your work and pass a judgment or appreciate it or not appreciate it. But the politician is a very different entity. And I also grew up under a dictatorship. And so I'm very concerned by this idea of bringing art so close to government, because even if you had the best intentions of the world, the next person around may use those tools in a different way. Like this Center for Openness and Dialogues is part of the Prime Minister building, and it could be misused. And it's like a center of power, but there has to be separation of power too. So
I think, I mean, again, I'm not here representing the center, but I do have my own experience. I was very involved with the first exhibition. I was very involved in the first discussion about the center, about this possibility of producing a site where one could bridge between politics and art. Now, one thing is clear, is that when you do things, you provoke, you create the possibility that judgments can be made, and they are not perfect. But I believe in producing reality. I believe that it's better to do them and then learn from the critiques, whether they are objective or subjective, rather than do nothing, and like this, nothing can come back to you. I think this place, that program, is something that is absolutely not controlled by him. I think one should also understand it in context, and I don't know whether, like you said, it depends who is there after. Is it somebody who's able to allow this tool to become something meaningful for the city instead of using it as a tool? Or maybe it won't have a place in 10 years, in 5 years, in 15 years. I don't know. This really depends also how the people take it and make it their own tool, that place. But still, it's very important to know, and not just as a symbol or as a metaphor, but this was a place, that was a building that from the fascist time, through the communist time, through the 20-plus years of transition, was a very opaque building. Now, it's not because you make a new architecture with transparent glass that you believe that democracy took control of a building. But still, the fact that people can go in, see things, judge things, artists can go there and make a work which is critical to the decision of the guy who has a table, who's sitting one floor above. This is a reality. This is not what we decide to write or to blog or to say about. That's something that can be visited, seen. So it made possible for people to go in a space which was highly symbolic and representable and opaque. And again, is to feel that this is not a binary thing. This is not a you are in or you are out. It does not mean that because you go in, then you are you have an eye and an ear within everything and all the decisions that are taken there. But still, it makes this place of power more penetrable, more. It opens the pores of that building. So, having said that, we have heard many critiques. I think it's like Christine said, there is no other place like that one. This is what makes it special. Part of there are critiques which are objectively interesting, and they have absolutely a point. There are many things that can be improved, but like I said before, I think it's always worth improving things that maybe were done wrong than having nothing to improve because you don't take a risk of doing anything.
I understand. It's just that, again, as artists, sometimes we assume just because it's art, it's okay. And this summer we had a lot of controversy, like the Sam Durant piece that went down in Minnesota. It was a piece that toured in Europe. It was in the last Documenta, and I thought it was beautiful, but now I realize the problems that there could be with that piece. And it's just, for me, it was very important to realize that as an artist, I had to be aware that once we talk about politics, just because there's art involved, it doesn't mean that this is okay.
Can I just also... I just want to respond to what you're saying, as not to you, what you're specifically saying. But what I liked most about your piece, coming from a music background myself, was the way in which the intersecting topographies of it are so multi-layered that I could bring the entirety of myself to it, all my imagination, my personal experience, my political understandings. And so what's interesting about your piece, for me, and what you're saying, is that you have left it, the word you were looking for was permeable. All the boundaries of your work are permeable. When you said before that the music prints the wallpaper, I felt when I went close to it and looked at the patterns. You talk about synesthesia in the cat, or somebody's written about synesthesia. I felt like I was, even though it's not a the space is a wall, I felt the closer I went to it, the more I was completely immersed myself as a self there with your work. And that's what's so interesting about this idea of, interpretation, or we interpret it. You're talking about a piece that you interpreted one way, and now you look at it in hindsight, you think, well, it's got a political message that I'm not entirely in tune with, or whatever. Your work, actually, for me, now you explained the part about this wonderful old film of your mother speaking with the lips moving, and you realised how incredibly rigid the language was because it was part of a political structure, has blossomed into that work in there. I find totally phenomenal. It's just, it's so hideous word, but it's so transformational inside my own head. I now feel like I have a connection with the inside of your head, if that makes. And I didn't grow up in a country I grew up, in New Zealand and Australia, so they're not oppressive regimes in the way you're discussing. Some ways they are, but because yes, of course it depends who you are precisely. But I like that about your work, so I thought I would just jump in. It's not really a question, sorry, it's just addressing this idea.
No, but thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That is very, very nicely.
Well, I'm very happy that you put things like this, because there is all these debates you can read wherever in the press. An artist should be politically involved or not, and now in the States it's pretty huge after the Whitney Biennale and many other issues. Well, and it's the topic of the Documenta, and also from the Biennale in a way, but very differently. But what I want to say is that my personal view on this is very close to Anri's, is that there is always a political dimension in a lot of the work you can see. It's just that it's not the first thing you think about when you get to meet the work. And with Anri, there is always a political background, always an analysis of the political structures. That's in his DNA somehow. If you remember the work in the French pavilion, which was in the German pavilion, the story of Paul Wittgenstein, who was from a very rich family that had to leave Austria because of Nazism, and who lost his hand in the First World War. All this was the background of Germany, and Nazism was very strong, but was not the first thing you had to see, And this, I would say, openness of the meaning, which is characteristic of Anri's work, for me is a mark of the real artwork.
I think I've been teaching my students this, but yes, you all they're all nodding. Yeah.
They all agree.
They all agree with me.
Agree.
They have to agree with me. Well, they often disagree with me.
But does
Yes.
some of you have a reaction to this, or I mean, about these political issues?
young generation.
The young generation. Tell us something about that. That's really.
Yeah.
Do you have a
Micro.
So what's your link from politics to humanism in this exhibition? Like, because I think...
Don't talk to me, it's
Oh, so I think two years ago the Biennale was based on politics, maybe, and this is humanism. So can I just have your interpretation of what humanism means to you and how your work politically is connected to the humanism side of it?
But my work is not political. I'm a political being, and it's reflected in my work. And I think this is also, I have to thank you for the way you spoke of the work. To me, it's very important that the work does not tell people what to think or how to use it. Or so it's again, to me, it's very important. Where I want to have control on my work is I want to have control to make sure that the doors remain open. And this is a political attitude. And then what goes in and out, what they perceive, what they bring in back to the work, whether I like or agree or disagree with it, I don't mind letting go at that point, as long as I completely control this structure which keeps the work generous enough. And this needs control. This does not come across by chance. So I'm not here to say, let go. I mean, and Christine knows we've been working so much together. I'm not somebody who lets go entirely, but I know where I choose to control. And this, I believe, is at so that the work can become generous and let go and let in and out other approaches and opinions. So in that sense, this brings us into this relation between politics and humanity, for me, I believe very much in one thing, and I'll give you the example also where the first time I encountered it, which is absolutely not political, but it's like I believe in collective subjectivity, in shared subjectivity. So I don't believe in so much in how much is put in this vase of objectivity. So for me, I could say that I do a lot of it intuitively, but I do stand by the fact that I try to increase the space of this collective subjectivity. That we do, within our own private perceptions, mine de rien, like you say in French, like, nonetheless, we share a lot together. And this now I'll bring it a little bit outside an example which doesn't relate so much with politics. I mean, now everything connects with politics because it has to do with weather and subjectivity and narratives. I did this project quite some years ago, which is I did a selection of around 60 films, which I chose out of hundreds of films that I saw. And each of those films made me feel temperature. And so there was this program, which each film corresponds to 1 degree, and whichever film is shown inside, it depends on a thermometer outside, like a mini weather station, which decides when to start the film, when to stop it, another one comes in, etc. And to do this, I mean, there are some films that there were certain objective truths about what the weather was in that film. But for many others, I asked other people to tell me what they think. And it was amazing. I was so surprised how many people would put the same film within a range of 2 degrees. And this is an apolitical example to tell how much we share in our perceptions. Because we think that perceptions is about subjectivity and judgment is about objectivity. But there is a lot in and out. So to bring it back to my work, I think to me it's very important that perception and choice, which is left with the listener and the viewer, it's left with them, but it's to keep it open so that they feel enabled. I wouldn't say they feel empowered. It's such a big word and very, very often overrated, but they feel allowed in, that they have a seat next to the pilot, so to say. So this is, so again, my work is not political. Although I believe, and like Christine said, the ones that seems to have the less to do with the politics, in my own experience when I work on them, are the most political. in the sense that intervista it is, but it deals with history. So it deals with so many things which were at stake.
And also the context
But
where it's shown. For example, your piece at the French pavilion was in the German pavilion, so the,
Absolutely.
the political dimension was so
But,
strong. When you show it in the new museum, it was very different.
Absolutely. There is one thing that comes across very little unless somebody would read this text in the catalog that you edited, which we asked a lawyer, because when you do copyright, it's such a Western thing.
I
Copyright
read that thing,
issues. In order to record, in order to be able to record the music with an orchestra in France, you had to have to pay the copyright, because Ravel in France, up to then, maybe it has changed in the past 2 years, it was still in the private domain. In Germany, at that year, Ravel was already 6 years, perhaps, it was in the public domain, meaning to show the work in the German pavilion, we did not need to have copyright. So there is an interval, there is an overlap, there is a contradiction, and this all refers to the 2 world wars. So it's extremely political. I mean, not let alone to say that, in this and the absence of the right hand, and why would people write so many pieces of music exactly at the time between the 2 wars about the left hand? How come there are thousands of compositions for the left hand and less than 100 for the right hand? Why does it correspond to a period where there was a culture of the right-handed, but also to a period when people played music so much, because you couldn't listen back to music. So to listen to music meant making it, playing it. And so immediately losing a limb, losing a hand, it meant to a reduction of music, which was counterbalanced by composing music for the remaining hand, which most of the time was the left one, for many reasons, that people in the war were using much more the right hand. So all this is, I mean, I think to me it's extremely more political than things that seem on a first level to be more political.
But there is a point which is, might be interesting for your own thinking, is that it's always about translation. The issue of translation is crucial towards cultures, right? And how can you translate a word into your language, with my language? That's a subject of a famous work of Anri called La Cat. Maybe you can say a word of that. It was a subject also about this pavilion where you had 2 pianists doing the same music but with their own version, so the translation of the partition into music. And here too, actually, there is a translation of the visual into music. So maybe just to deepen this idea, which is deeply political because it's about intercultural exchanges.
Stereo.
I'm very bad into techniques, you know that.
I can speak in stereo.
There's water there.
No, but this is a very good example of this work, the La Carte, because it's a work that I did, I can't remember precisely, but let's say it was somewhere around 2003 or 2004. And it's a work where, when I was in Senegal, where there are many languages, but the most spoken language is Wolof, which does not necessarily associate to the largest ethnic group, but it's the most spoken language. And it's a language, Senegal has been a French colony, and it's a language that is extremely rich in all the differences in the intervals between white and black, and all the grades in between, whether it applies mainly to skin, meaning power and hierarchy, or to whether color itself, lighting condition. But it has lost the words for the primary language colors, meaning it doesn't have a word for red or blue or green or yellow. It has other ways of conveying it. It's say the color of the sky or the color of the corn, or in order to bring the. And so when I did this work, I invited these children to. I chose together with an adult, which somebody worked in the radio station, a group of words which fulfilled all this trajectory between white and black, or bright and dark. And then the children would repeat them. And you know, there is so many things that come across and one could talk about it. But once the work was finished, I started to work again with that work later, and like I've been working on it again in the past months. I want to translate it in Spanish, because I want to translate it in the Spanish of 4 different countries, which relate in terms of history of colonization and the power differently. So Venezuela, Spain, Mexico, and Argentina. And it's very interesting in terms of subjectivity. It's like every word, every notion of color, actually, it means nothing without who looks at it. It's a GPS, which means nothing if you don't have the software. So it was very interesting how the same word, which is something like almost white, depending on the color of the translator, he would see it as rather almost white or not as white. So it's interesting how, you know, all this, the in-betweenness and subjectivity that goes in between, and how suddenly the subtitle does no longer translate the image, but translates the viewer or the translator, somebody who is outside the frame. And for example, the first time I did it, it was between American English and British English, and there you had a big difference. For example, in a word called in British English was the whitey, and in American we translate it as the great white hope. And from the, I'm simplifying a bit now but like from the British has a relation to the color and to the other, and the geographical and the relation to colonization is something which is outside, while the United States is more something which is from within. And the Great White Hope is a nickname which was given to, I forgot the first name, Johnson, who was the first boxer who took the heavy weight title in the beginning of last century. And it was, now for us it's the most normal thing, but back then it was a shock to the white establishment. So they tried to, they put together this initiative which they called the Great White Hope, to bring money together to fight somebody who would fight him and get the title back. And this whole operation was called the Great White Hope. And eventually, finally, they convinced somebody who had been held previously a title and to fight back, and he lost again. So the Great White Hope, it means both a projection of power, but also a loss of power at the same time, because they could not defend the title. So it's such a rich word that you can only translate it. If you say it to somebody in England, they wouldn't know what it means. And I also didn't know about it previously. So there are all these windows and that open, and these intervals between the words that we don't know of when we look at them only from our own perspective. But the moment that we bring in the other perspectives, then we see how where there appears to be nothing, suddenly there is a space of interpretation.
So it's a return to language for you?
But again, it highlights how, yes, it highlights to what...
Because they were repeating in loop, and like that, so
yeah.
it was more like
A rhythm.
That's also it's not imposed, because, like, for example, some of these like words, like which in Spain would which in France would even be forbidden, like buñol, for example. So there are also words or other words that carry like tubab, or like that carry a very strong connotation. But the fact that they repeat so much, they lose their sense. So you, as a listener and viewer, you have the choice of grappling with it, or just the repetition would do it for you. In the same way that, I mean, I guess most of us remembers when we're kids, and then sometimes you repeat your own name to the point you don't recognize yourself, because it becomes a sound. So this work has that quality that it somehow numbs its own content by making it musical.
So through repetition, it completely loses all content.
It's really to the. It does not lose it. It does not lose it. It allows for the possibility of somebody to choose to numb itself with the repetition. So in that sense, it's not again, it does not impose itself.
So maybe the conclusion would be that even if your kids don't want to go to their violin lessons, you should really insist, because maybe there will be
until they can't handle it anymore.
Conclusion.
Yeah. Okay, so if there are no other questions, yes, can you? Oh, okay.
Does your work always stay in the gallery space? Do you extend beyond the gallery space, or do you do work that goes out into the community?
That's a very big question, because it depends where these spaces are, how much they are part of the community life. It's very difficult to judge it. I know I've been lucky to exhibit it in so many places, and some of them maybe they are too central, and others are more peripheral, and so it's. I mean, I wouldn't be able to answer your question without breaking it down in which context we are talking about.
You went to Australia, by the way, because you're.
Yes, I'm doing a project which should be shown in Australia in October, and actually it's not like it's an outdoor piece, so it's not because outdoor that it's suddenly all of a sudden going to the community, but again it's like the sense of community is it's not the walls of a gallery that makes something less belonging to a community or more belonging to the community. It's not a matter of I don't think it's a matter of indoors and outdoors.
Okay, could you please use the? Is there a micro there? Yeah.
Your nation
So-
still contemplate
Mike.
joining the European community.
Could you repeat it with the
I know, I
micro,
understand.
please?
A national policy to join the European community.
Yeah.
Albania.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a representative here, a director of the nation, but I would say, since we are here and not to leave without the answer, I don't know the exact numbers, but I believe by far a huge majority of the country wants to join the European community. But in a way it depends, because it depends, again, who hears that. Because people think that joining European community, people, let's say perhaps in England or in all the places where they have become very afraid of this, means that people want to come. No, to join European community is a journey within yourself to become a more democratic society, to become a society that is able to afford and allow its citizens higher standards. And so it's a journey within itself. So it's not a journey which is owned by the ones who have it already. It's a journey which is owned by the ones who will to undertake it. And I think the majority of the people by far will to undertake the journey.
Yes.
I come from New York, and we've been talking a lot about politics in its relation with art. I have lived through periods in New York in which local politics, which is immobiliare, which is real estate. We had a great senator named Tip O'Neill from Boston, and he said all politics are local. And in 1979, you could rent an apartment in the Lower East Side of Manhattan for $45. 1 year later, we had not lived through the tragedy of communism, of the Iron Curtain. But real estate, immobiliare, in 1 year increased the rent from $45, $50 to 1,000. That is a great inflation. Largely, that came through, ironically, through art.
You mean art or gentrification?
Artists came and improved the neighborhood. Cafes, restaurants, young bourgeois entered the neighborhood and the rent went up. But it operated on a political level. Eddie Rama, with his employment, political employment of Bauhaus color, is such a beautiful, the most beautiful maneuver after Joseph Beuys in Germany. After all, Joseph Beuys founded the Grüne Partei, the Green Party. There was always a political agenda in Bauhaus, in Weimar and Dessau. And today, among the nations of post-89, the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the ideological battle, which was always a battle of aesthetics and of art. I'm looking here at a young man who has Viva Cuba, a marvelous message. The small nations, but essential nations, such as Albania, Cuba, as opposed to the monumental nations of the post-communist world. Aesthetically, artistically, a political strategy of culture. Where do you see Albania positioning itself in this post-capitalist future?
Small questions.
This is a bit like at the condition that I would be invited in the next Venice Biennial, I could come with the answer. But but it's it's not about repeating. I think, like you said yourself, it's not a monumental country, so it's not a country that can make big choices. But it's a country that can make its own choices that fit to it. And
we'll get the answer the next Biennale.
and that's what I said. It's like context is very important. So the moment when you mentioned, for example, the relation between arts, gentrification, and immobiliare, like real estate values in New York, one could say, oh yes, in Albania, definitely also in Tirana, the price has gone higher. But it's not the same thing. Everything is relative, have gone. Most of the people own their apartments. I was reading completely by chance that apparently more than 90% of the people own their homes. So the fact that it increases the value does not mean that it makes it impossible for others to live, but it just increases the value of what people have. So I think the same combinations between political decisions, aesthetics, or application of art in the city can improve the value, but the improvement of the value does not turn it into a place where others cannot come in because they cannot afford it, just because the relation between between ownership and who lives in the city and who wants to be part of the city are very different between Tirana, say, and New York. So it's a very different situation.
Okay.
A connection between
Yeah.
the remaking between communist national survivors on a smaller scale, such as Cuba.
To me, yeah. Okay. The end of the question, and then he'll answer later. No, okay.
Can
you sorry.
Having
interrupt you, but I think that
come from a country, a nation that was totally cut off, as was Japan, for 200 years. You guys got it better because it was only for the Cold War.
He'll give him a private
And is there a communication between Cuba,
sorry,
among others,
we are turning
and
it a bit
Albania?
on a political.
Henry, just to say that we are so deeply grateful for this beautiful talk and also for this amazing talk.
Thank you. Yes. Yes. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And now you can eat, yes. Of course. Thank you.